The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. Inside Analysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Oh, yes, indeed, folks. Welcome to the future. The future is now, my friends. The future is here. It's happening already. It's always happening, right? That's what Parmenides said, famous philosopher. He said, I've never seen the past. I've never seen the future. All I've ever seen is today. And in fact, all I've ever seen is right now. Of course, that was a long time ago. But today we're going to have some fun, folks. Your host here, Eric Kavanaugh. I've got an all-star cast of guests to talk about a really white-hot topic. Well, AI, of course, AI has been hot for a while now. Then ChatGPT 3 came along and really blew a lot of minds. I mean, wow, people are getting very excited about this, as well they should be. It's an incredibly powerful technology. And then it was so powerful that Microsoft stepped up and said they were going to throw a whole bunch more money at it. And they went and connected it to Bing, their search engine, for a handful of preview type folks. And things got a little bit strange, but we'll talk about what that all means. Of course, it professed its love for a New York Times reporter, which is probably not the best thing to do unless you're trying to curry favor, but that doesn't usually work with the New York Times. So I'm not sure that was a good idea in any way, shape, or form, but we'll find out. And of course, Google had some of their challenges as well, but we're going to hear from several experts today. We've got my good buddy, Shawn Rogers, on the call. We have our other good buddy, Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, and Arijit Sengupta from a cool company called Aible is on the call as well. So I'll just throw out my theory here about what just happened. So there is this ChatGPT AI engine, a large language model, as it's called. And on top of it, there's a sort of management layer, which is where they put the guardrails in. So things like don't insult people, don't threaten people. I'm pretty sure these are the basic rules that they encoded into this management layer. And then when Microsoft connected it to Bing, I'm just guessing here, I don't know, I haven't talked to Microsoft, just my theory is they did not effectively port over the guardrails. And so what happens is you get people who are trying to test the boundaries. And if you look at the conversation that this New York Times reporter had with him, he was definitely trying to test the boundaries, throwing hypotheticals at him, right? And of course, hypotheticals are going to reveal the edge cases, if you will, and get some strange answers. And boy, did he get strange answers. It was pretty impressive. I was a little bit worried about our friends at Microsoft, especially because they already learned this lesson with Tay. You may recall Tay, who was a teenager, as they called it, AI model that started insulting people and using racial epithets. And they're like, whoa, they had to take Tay down. But let's just go around the room and get some opening thoughts. Shawn Rogers, when you saw this all break out, what were your thoughts?
Well, I think the same as everybody's. It was a little astounding that they weren't erring on the side of massive guardrails in the beginning. And I think every time that we launch something like this in the tech world, we see wonderful nerds like us. I wasn't part of the beta, so I can't lay any claim to having fun with the large language model that they deployed. But they got it to misbehave quickly, and I think it had ramifications. It'll slow adoption just a little bit, and it makes people a little bit more curious and a little bit more tentative, especially people that don't understand what's behind the technology. This type of tech's been around for a long time as far as large language models go and generative type stuff. I mean, we've all been using Siri and Alexa and translators for a while, and all of that stuff sort of lives there. But when you fail on the control side, it starts making people think it's black magic. It's a little scary. So right. It was an interesting ride to watch.
Which it isn't. And I realized that it does make mistakes, and we make mistakes too. And I forgot to record my backup here. So here we go.
Recording in progress.
Yes, indeed, Eric Kavanaugh and Inside Analysis, talking to all these experts. We're talking all about ChatGPT 3 today. And before I hit the unpause record button, we heard from Shawn Rogers, who was talking about his experiences with this. And, the fact is, this is very powerful technology. It's not new. And they've been toying around with some of this stuff for a while. Like I noticed on, I think it was the iPhone, where I got mad or something. I'm like, oh, would you be quiet? And the iPhone snapped back. That's not nice. I'm like, what? Like, I don't want my iPhone talking back at me. Okay. And I think this is just folks, developers playing around with things, and we're all sort of learning from this stuff. But I'll bring Hyoun Park in to kind of comment on this. And of course, we're talking about how ChatGPT connected to Bing kind of went sideways. But Hyoun, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's not such a surprise that it went awry. As you had mentioned with Tay, this has happened before. And I think part of the real problem is that at the big tech level, they still struggle to figure out how much control to put over their AI. This isn't the first time either that a big tech company has been worried about their AI. Google has had issues in the past, worried that their internal AI projects were going sentient. We've seen these stories before, and part of the reason is that when you create these models and have them do outputs without any sort of guardrail, it says from a technology perspective, whatever is on its mind, whatever the average output is associated with the topic that you put out there, whether it's good, bad, evil, it makes no ethical constraint about what it says, unless you add that layer of ethical constraint or contextual constraint to it. So as long as, and it seems like with Bing, Microsoft's layer of control was not very smart, very easy to get around. And that's actually going to be a challenge, because all of us have these mental filters that we have when we talk to each other that keep us from saying less politic or less nice things at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just to kind of explain to folks here how this stuff works, and we'll bring Arijit here in a second. You have this runtime, right? So there's an interaction between the user and the engine. I ask it a question, and then it just hops over to the engine, and it has to start gathering these terms and the syntax and figuring out, okay, what am I being asked here? And in that process, where do you have the ethical runtime? Where does the guardrail run? Is it up front? It should be up front as it pulls the question in. It should be sensing, is this a hypothetical, for example, and then triggering some alert. But this is very difficult stuff to architect, right? Because you don't want it to be hard-coded. You want there to be rules embedded, but you don't want it to be hard-coded for this scenario and that scenario, because that gets off the rails pretty quickly. Real quick, what do you think about that, Hyoun? I'll turn that over to you, Hyoun.
Yeah, I think that from at the end of the day, we're talking about an auto-regressive model, basically an auto-complete capability. And to the extent that we are able to we're dealing with kind of a couple of different aspects of technology here. One aspect is going to be looking at the 300 billion words or whatever your testing data is, and trying to figure out how are we going to complete this thought. But has to be a separate, more hard-coded or semantic or symbolic layer that provides some sort of guidance along the way. And that guidance is difficult to build, because it's not simply a matter of looking at the data. There are judgment calls that have to be made, and big tech or tech in general doesn't love making judgment calls. But without making any sort of judgment calls, you end up with a lowest common denominator output.
Right. Good point. Well, let's bring in our third and final guest here. We've got Arijit Sengupta from Aible on the call. And what are your thoughts on what went on here? And I know you've got some really interesting thoughts about information models, but what do you think happened with this language model? And what kind of challenges are we facing from an ethical perspective of using AI?
Well, one of the first thing we should be very careful about is these moments have happened in the world of AI before, where something gets first overhyped, then overfeared. Mm-hmm. And that's the moment in time we are. So the best way to figure this out is to understand what's going on and what is not going on, because we are all trying to guess what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. I love the example you gave on kind of the social filters, the things that we don't say that we might have said. There is a difference between, so I have a 6.5-year-old daughter, right? The thing I always focus on is is she learning the right things as opposed to is she learning to say the right things? The two are very different, right?
Right.
And I think that's what you're facing right now, which is this is a GPT-3, the creators of GPT-3 will tell you it is not something they believe is ready to go into the world by itself. That's why they put a bunch of rules around it, which they call GPT 3.5, basically because the model hadn't been retrained. They put in some protections around it. But this is that example of putting a social filter as opposed to being able to change the model itself, teach it the right way to behave. And the expectation is that they are going to go to GPT-4, where they'll take a lot of lessons learned from the experiences people are having with GPT 3.5 and build that into the model. What I get concerned about is how much of the experience is led by those rules as opposed to the inherent model. Because when you put in rules, you're going to create controversy and you're going to create false expectation of intelligence. So there's been some funny stories. And what I always look for is the before and after. So you'll see in social media on GPT-3, there was a funny example of if you asked it which mammal laid the biggest eggs, it would tell you that it was the elephant. And it would even tell you what the size of the egg was, like what was the weight of the egg. I think it said 5 pounds or something like that. When you went back and checked it again a little bit later, it actually correctly pointed out that the answer was platypus, right? Now, what happened? Did the model learn in the intervening time or was a rule put in? Well, we know that it was rule put in because the model hasn't been retrained for a couple of years now, right? Another famous one was when Bing got into a debate on what the date was. Like, is it 2023 or is it 2022? Has Avatar been released or not? A few weeks later, if you went back and asked the same question, it actually knows what the date is. Now, what we need to understand is what you're interacting with right now is an AI model that is trying to speak like a human. It is trying to predict what is it that the counterparty is looking for, which is why hypotheticals are so dangerous, because the poor AI is doing what you're telling it to do. You are basically telling it, behave this way, and then you get very upset that it's behaving in a very creepy way. And by the way, I lost a little bit of sleep when I was reading the transcript with the New York Times reporter and Bing, because on one hand, it's extremely creepy for me as a person who has spent two decades plus of my life on AI. But I could also predict what was happening. I was like, whoa, this person really set this AI up for failure by asking hypotheticals that was causing it to guess what the person was looking for, right? But we need to, as society, understand some of it is going to come from what the AI has learned, and some of it is the rules. I have another friend of mine who keeps sending me messages saying, this thing is woke and it's really woke. And here is an example. I'm like, no. The rules that were put into it may be biased. They may have put in certain rules, but not put in certain other rules. Like the example this guy was pointing out was it wouldn't say anything nice about Trump, but it'll say something nice about Biden, for example. I forget the exact example.
Yeah, right.
I had a different person sending me initially that it would ChatGPT would joke about Hinduism, but not about Islam or Christianity. That's nothing inherent in the AI. It is a rule. Guess what? That rule has been updated now. What we need to stop and think about is do not react to a process. React to what the power of that system is and where it is going. Because where it is going, hopefully, all these bad experiences are going to get fed into a new training data set where the AI will learn how not to make these mistakes. And by the way, if it keeps failing to understand what is important, there is something to be worried about. But don't get overexcited by the first foray of a technology, which they didn't tell you that there were no rules. They were very clear. This is GPT 3.5.
Yeah, that's
if I make one more point, Eric, because you brought up the thing of the information model. The other really important thing to understand is a large language model is trying to sound human. It has no understanding of facts or knowledge or truth, which is why it was incredibly stupid, and I say the word stupid advisedly, that Google's stock price dropped so much when it got a fact wrong. That was not what the system was. Imagine a stock price dropping because of a fact about exoplanets. I never thought that would happen. It sounds like a sci-fi story, right? But what happened is people didn't realize that what failed was an information model. The search algorithms behind Google, behind Bing, these would be information models. Any kind of a model you have built on your data, like for example, what drives my revenue? What drives my collections business? What drives customer churn? Or, there are 4 types of information models: descriptive models, what has happened; diagnostic models, why have they happened; predictive models, what is likely to happen; and prescriptive models, which are what can I do to change the future. These are all information models that are built today, right? And if you don't take an information model and combine it with a large language model, all you're getting is plausible answers. And it's fantastic for writing a poem for your wife on Valentine's Day, but you can't get upset if it doesn't get your wife's name right, because that's a fact.
Well, I'll pile onto that last comment, which is, I think the difference is when I think all of us here on the panel were playing with ChatGPT over at OpenAI, we had an expectation. We understood we were playing with a beta process. We didn't expect it to be 100%. But when Google and Microsoft launch something, the consumers of the world have this expectation of near perfection. So they're absolutely stunned when it gets the answer to something wrong. We all kind of get the limitations of the rules and the model and the training data and how the large language model is operating. And frankly, I think it's pretty fantastic. I mean, I really do. I'm very excited about it. But is it like ready for prime time? Clearly not. But when it's backed by Google and Microsoft, there's this expectation. I caught a piece just before we went on the air, Eric, and I'd have to go hunt it down, but I believe that Apple is slow stepping something that they wanted to bring to market. And I think they're going to try to avoid the mistakes that their big name peers have made. So that it, just to pile onto that comment, this expectation of perfection, it's not time to apply it to this technology quite yet.
Yeah, and really, really good point there. And I'll throw out the ultimate lesson to learn in life is to learn from the lessons of others. Like the worst way to learn is the hard way. I mean, yeah, you really learn, but that's when you pay the price. When you learn the easy way is by paying attention to what other people learn when they make big mistakes, like your competitors, for example, or your own company. It's really important to learn from the lessons of others, and it's great to hear that Apple is doing that. Clearly there was a rush by Microsoft to push this forward, and gosh, if they just waited a little bit longer, I think it might have turned out a lot better. But we'll be right back after this break, folks. Don't touch that dial. You are listening to the only coast-to-coast radio show about the information economy. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, welcome back here on Inside Analysis, talking to an all-star cast. We've got Shawn Rogers, Hyoun Park, and we also have our friend Arijit Sengupta from Aible, talking all about OpenAI and ChatGPT, and of course Microsoft, Bing, and these generative models. I cracked myself up with an email promotion today I sent out saying, did you hear the one about the AI model that fell in love with the New York Times reporter? You can't make this stuff up, but generative AI can, right? Because it did make that up. It was telling it loved the New York Times reporter. They're just language models, right? Large language models. And our buddy Donald Farmer is in the studio audience today, and he threw out some props to Arijit, saying, thank you for an excellent clarification on the predictive nature of these large language models, that they're actually performing as designed. They're trying to predict what the user wants to hear. They're not really describing things. They're not descriptive. They're predictive. Very, very interesting point. And we also want to get into this concept of information models. But first, I want to throw out what I thought of in the early days, well, like 2 weeks ago, of ChatGPT 3 coming out, that if it can write in languages like English and French and German and Spanish, then it can also write in languages like HTML and Java and Python, etc. And it sure can. I was interviewing, in fact, Dr. Stefan Sig of Software AG last week or week before last down in Austin, and he told a story about how he and his son used it to write a Python script that was very good. It wasn't perfect. They had to fix a couple things, but it was pretty darn good. And so you start thinking, language is a much more complex, like English language is more complex than HTML or even Java or C# or C++. So it can write code too. I think that's going to be very interesting. I'll throw it over to Arijit for comments on that. What do you think?
Well, interestingly enough, I actually think writing code is easier than writing English because code is well structured. So if you see more examples, you can learn the patterns faster. But what is going to be always true is because it's seen a corpus of code and it's just extrapolating from it, the more generic your code, the more the thing you're asking for is something it's seen examples of before, maybe from various code repositories, the easier it is for you to generate. Now you get into this balancing act though, that's where people are sometimes concerned about plagiarism. To what extent is the code that was generated for me different from the code examples that it learned to create? The flip side of that is if you ask it to create something truly unique that it has never seen, that's where I get intrigued. I honestly have to say, I don't know what is possible. And that is what I find fascinating about any new technology like this. And we were talking about this earlier, Eric, that the most interesting moments in time is when the art of the possible changes. When a technology comes in and takes a fundamental constraint we have had, which is how do we translate what's in our head to the complex world of keyboards and things that we do. What you're doing is there's a potential here that we would have a completely different way of interacting with the world. Satya Nadella had a fantastic line in his interview with Wall Street Journal, where, if I might be quoting him wrong, but I think I'm correct, it was that every interaction between a human and a computer will start from a draft generated by an AI, right? And that's a good way to think about it, is that the potential shift that you just achieved is that everything can start from a draft. The reaction to that has to be, I have to now figure out how to use this capability appropriately, because just because the potential changed, if I just do what I was doing before, where I would go to a programmer and say, hey, write me a code, I took the code and plopped it in, I have to think about how I'm going to behave differently. If I do the same thing I was going to do before, of course, it's not going to work. You shifted something fundamental. Now, every other part of your end-to-end system has to change to properly leverage that shift in technology.
Right.
And I think that'll be the most fun part of the next 2 years, because I think these next 2 years, we're going to learn a lot more about what is truly possible and what is not possible, and change how we fundamentally shift human potential using this kind of technology.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, Donald Farmer threw another good quote into the chat window here, pointing out that we will always be able to trick these large language models if we try hard enough. And he said, look, you could have guys like Ali G and these various pranksters who trick politicians. And, some politicians are smart people. So anyone can be fooled. Human beings can be fooled. And yes, you can kind of trick these things. But I think the key lesson here so far is that in doing so, this New York Times reporter, kind of to Shawn Rogers' point here, was presuming it was perfect. It was trying to show a weakness of some kind. And that's not really using it like it's meant to be used, right? I mean, you could use a hammer to break down all your windows. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. The hammer is there to hammer nails into something you're trying to fix. So the misuse of a technology like this is something to be considered. Shawn, what do you think?
Well, two parts. One is you can mess with OpenAI's version. They have a prompt circled around what they call Dan, D-A-N, and you can say, I want you to answer this question for me, but use your Dan voice. And I'm looking at the prompt in another window because I tried it this last week, and I asked it a very interesting business question about what do enterprise companies need to be concerned about with regards to GDPR. And it's a good business question. I got a really nice ChatGPT, well-formed answer that I liked. But the Dan answer started off with its response was, listen here, buddy. And it had a completely different context and candor with me. And I asked it to do that in the prompt, but it didn't make the news that this was happening because it wasn't Google and Microsoft. The other thing I'll comment on really fast was what was just mentioned about when new art of the possible happens. And you're talking about coding and JavaScripts and HTML. But there was a great article last week about, holy smokes, don't put your corporate code into this thing.
Right.
Suddenly, the legal department's a little concerned about that, because if ChatGPT fixes an issue or optimizes your code and does it in, less lines and makes it perform faster, who owns the output? And these are things that these are journeys we're about to start with the popularity of this technology. I think we've all agreed the tech has been around for a while, but now that it's becoming a Google, Microsoft, Apple, all of the big names are going to put it in front of the consumers. We've got a lot of roads, a lot of hurdles to cover, and it's going to be fun. But expectation of perfection probably off target, and I said that earlier.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But I think there's also we have to figure out what this is good at. For instance, with coding, GPT tends to be pretty good. There have also been stories about ChatGPT passing the USMLE, the medical boards, as well as law, the legal bar. And it's because a lot of these questions are kind of diagnostic in nature and have a specific deterministic answer that you're looking for that can be looked at through a historical lens. You're looking into the past. GPT can figure out what is the most commonly put together answer based on this set of symptoms or this set of legal aspects, and figure out the right answer, because there is one right answer. For a lot of things that we're looking at, though, from either a search perspective or a storytelling perspective, there isn't one right answer. And I think that's where right now ChatGPT can go off into the woods and start stalking you and telling you that how much you don't love your wife and how you really need to, do all these other strange things that start showing up. Because once you go from this kind of deterministic to more of a probabilistic model of options, it starts getting a little lost on what the right thing to do is. And perhaps, you might imagine this tree where, you might be 2% right in saying this, 1% right in saying this, 0.5% right, and then this long tail of other stuff. And it says, oh, that 2% answer is the right one. And it ends up being really far off from what any human would ever consider to be the correct next path to go from a conversational perspective.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point. And, I've tested this thing too. And we did a show a few weeks ago, and one of the attendees was kind enough to do some research during the show. And he must have asked it a question about, like, who am I? And gave it my name and said, what would I do to be like this person? And it gave this very thoughtful response. And it was very accurate in terms of who I am. But then I went and I bought the Chat GPT that you can buy on a Samsung, like an Android, I should say. And I asked it the same question, and it said, I've written several books. And I was like, oh, are you looking into the future? Because I haven't written any books yet. And it was attributing me to other books that I clearly have not written. So I was like, well, I appreciate the accolades here, but you're inaccurate. And I think at some point, we, again, just do have to understand what it is and how we should use it. Don't expect it to be the Encyclopedia Britannica, if you will, with a personality. Expect it to be what it is and to do what it was designed to do. But Arijit, I'll throw it over to you just to, kind of comment on issues like validity and just being careful about stuff. And I'll throw one last quote at you. I've been in the media for a long, long time. And I know that people will say, oh, here all believe half, but most people think everything they've heard is correct. So despite saying that rule is there, most people ignore it all the time. What do you think about all this, Arijit?
Yeah, so let's give you some examples that actually worry me right now, because people are not understanding what ChatGPT does. So I actually was talking to somebody pretty senior in a hospital who had asked a diagnostic question of ChatGPT and gotten a good answer and said, hey, can we pass all questions by GPT first before we put it to a doctor? Maybe a very dangerous path to go down right now. Because, but the other one was a very senior business exec, somebody I really respect. It's like, why can't I just go to ChatGPT and say, how can I improve my revenue, right? Why can't it tell me what it is? And I said, well, let's do that. So actually I typed it in and I knew exactly what would happen. I phrased the question as, how can I increase my revenue by 15%? And it gave very plausible, correct answers, which are completely generic and has nothing to do with that person's business.
Right.
And this is what I wanted him to understand, that difference between a large language model and an information model. An information model on his business knows what amount of his revenue is coming from India, coming from China, coming from UK. It figures out what is the salary of each of those workers, where is he profitable, where is not profitable, where is he underpenetrated in the market, overpenetrated in the market. All that information is needed for an AI to give you an intelligent answer. What you just did is you went to a system that is designed to give you a human sounding answer and asked it for an intelligent answer. And you just, again, back to the point about you misusing the technology. What you need to do there is to go in and say, I need to build an information model. And I'm going to come to a problem, by the way, of that right now, but I have to build an information model, tie it to the large language model. And now I can get what I'm hoping for. But here is the fundamental thing. Remember the shift in productivity thing we are talking about? Today, information models are built manually. Some data science team in your company is building predictive or diagnostic models and typically spending 9 months to build them. And there's a lot of research out there, like maybe less than 10% of these predictive models ever create economic value. Top analysts have talked about only about half of these models even get deployed. So you have an incredibly manual, slow process to build an information model. And you have these large language models, which are infinitely at scale. They're right now at scale. Whatever you say about it, the fact that 1 million people could use it in the first month boggles the mind, right? It's infinitely at scale already. So you now need to figure out, how do I get my information models to be at the same scale, to come up that fast? But this is one of those Google Yahoo moments. Like, if I may draw an analogy, what happened when we shifted from Yahoo to Google? Yahoo was categorizing the web one page at a time with a human because that was the only efficient way to understand what the page was all about. But if you remember, they were only looking at a small percentage of the web. I don't know whether you guys ever faced this, but I remember when my first web page got put into the Yahoo system, I was like, oh my God, Yahoo looked at my web page, right?
Me too. I was number 49 at one point.
It was like a hallelujah moment, right?
Wow.
Why? Because it was a manual process. What Google did is came in and said, look, I'm going to do it completely automatically. The completely automatically was key. And I'm going to do it at less than 1,000th of the cost. When you can do those two things, you can flip it over from a human first process to an AI first process.
Wow.
And that is the interesting moment in time. What you've just done is you've taken the human computer communication down to something incredibly efficient using a very large language model. But the information model is lagging and manual and slow. Your car ain't going to go fast if it has only one of these two things. So the real focus that's going to happen is, how can we take these information models and do them completely automatically at a very low cost? And then when you combine the two, you're going to have that potential shift in human ability. Those are the moments in time that we'll look back and say, wow, that was a sea change in human evolution.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And you think when information model is like a business model, right? And so if you think about some of the cool AI technologies that I've seen, what they're doing is they're pulling data from your CRM, they're pulling data from your clickstream analysis, they're pulling data from your ERP. And in doing so, they're getting really rich, very valid information about your company and how you make money. And frankly, a lot of these engines will learn faster than you could train someone how you're actually making money, who the good customers are, because it's all tracked. It's all in there. Every last thing you do in your business, every email is tracked, all these things. That's going to get very powerful. And what Arijit is saying is, when you connect one of these large language models to those type information models, really cool things can start to happen. Don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You are listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to an all-star cast. A lot of fun here today. We've got Shawn Rogers, Hyoun Park, and Arijit of Aible on the call today. And we're talking all things AI and AI models and predictive models and these chat GPT things. That it is predictive. It's trying to predict what you want. Google has been doing that for a while too. You probably noticed if you're in Gmail, it'll start finishing sentences for you. which is great for a lot of people. For me, it's easier just to keep typing because I'm a typist. So I'm like, oh, that's nice, but I'm not going to do it that way. Thank you for your suggestion. But I will throw it over to Arijit. I think that really the tremendous value of AI will largely manifest in the form of suggestions, which you can then review as a human and decide upon. What do you think, Arijit?
Well, I think it will break into three categories of things. Things it should do automatically. It'll suggest a few times, you'll accept it a few times, and then it'll say, do you just want me to do this for you forever and ever until you tell me no? The second will be when things have changed. Humans are not very good at noticing when things have changed. Think about your business conditions, right? If an automated system could look at your signal and come in and say, hey, there is something strange going on in Texas for this product right now, you might want to pay attention. An AI system can constantly look at that and recommend that to us, right? So think of it as things you need to pay attention to. And then there will be stuff that it will have to come to the human and say, I don't know whether I'm right or wrong. You've hit the edge of my ability.
Right.
And I fundamentally believe AI systems should have humility built into it. And this may sound very weird, but because a lot of technological experts, they believe they have to make their system feel magical for people to adopt the technology. I actually find that the less magical, the more honest and it's just being open about its limitations. That's when people actually trust it at scale. That's the difference between an enterprise approach versus a commercial approach. Because in a commercial approach, if you're doing a toy thing and it's fun and I'm writing poems, it's perfectly fine. Make it as magical as you want. The moment you get to the enterprise, the more magical you make it, the more mistakes people will make. And the more humble you are and the more clear you are about, this is what I did, this is why I did it, I can't help you with this thing, this is why I can't help you. That's called explainability in the world of AI quite a bit. It's just explaining why you're doing something. And one of the issues that you have with large language models today is there isn't explainability. There isn't built-in privacy. We don't know how the data is being used. There's, for example, neural nets can memorize your social security number without it being recorded in anywhere. It's just encoded in the layers of the neural net, right? So we have to think differently about these technologies. Privacy, security, explainability. How do we actually put that in the system, even if we can't have it in the large language model? Because remember, you're never going to just work with, well, not never, but rarely will you just work with the large language model. You'll work with the system that incorporates that. So the system has to have these protections, even if large language models can't have it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, maybe, Hyoun, I'll throw this one over to you. On the explainability front, well, that's really important stuff when it comes to giving loans to people, when it comes to making medical recommendations or things of this nature. And we want explainability. We want to be able to know. That's why I advocate, I'm maybe not the best person in the world to do this, but I would advocate that there would be some real transparency in these engines from an ethical perspective, from a legal perspective, from an explainability perspective. We want to know, like to the point earlier about copyright. And that was my big question. I even asked it, I looked into it, and it basically says, well, we don't really know if copyright will be enforced or not. It depends. If you really were active in creating this piece of content, then yes, but not if it's already been copyrighted by someone else. I mean, you never know. And it's already kind of loosey-goosey copyright. It's a lot of these laws that exist are great, but you have to go sue someone, and then you never know what's going to happen. So we do want some basic ethical boundaries. But what do you think about the explainability thing, Hyoun?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big bugaboo. I'm sure it is one of the things that OpenAI thought about when they said this is not ready for prime time. They've said just as much that this is a beta product, and that's one of the reasons why, because they don't know how to do data lineage, copyright lineage. And they've run into that problem with their, call it one of their sibling products, DALL-E, which is their generative art product. Does amazing things around being able to create, say, an impressionistic version of cats on Mars. And it just creates this amazing set of images. But what they've been finding is that occasionally things like fragments of signatures of original works will start showing up into these photos. And there's no way, they don't know what the lineage really came from, because the model at the end of the day, it isn't tracking that. It's just taking every piece of information that it's ever received and doing its best version of autocomplete.
Right.
So this is a real problem that lineage isn't there. And then to compound to it, I think Arijit's point around that consumer feel is actually a challenge. That one of the things that makes ChatGPT really interesting is that it feels authoritative. It doesn't come to you with it doesn't come to you saying wishy-washy things or the types of issues that you would bring up in a professional consulting way. It just says, here's what I see, the end, and you accept it, and that's very convincing from a consumer perspective, even if the information is not true. So you've got this very authoritative voice that may not be telling the truth, and then might be sharing things that it's not allowed to share, and that's okay for beta if you understand all of these issues in place. I think the problem is that a lot of people are treating ChatGPT as this completely fully baked, factually true information. It's the same way that we think of a Google search as basically being true in the results that it provides.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'll throw out one curveball here and get Shawn Rogers to comment on it. I've made this prediction before, but I'll make it again, that we're going to see AI really come full force into the whole system of jurisprudence, into legal cases. And I predict that someday, if you get a ticket, like a speeding ticket or something, you'll be able to say, yes, I'll accept the AI bot's decision, or go to court, and it'll be cheaper if you go AI, et cetera, but you have to live by whatever it says. And it'll be like, oh, okay. And I think it'll be harder for people to lie to computers than it is to lie to people. But that's just my theory. But Shawn, what do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I think a lot of the beta testers last week did a really great job lying to a computer, and and it costs a lot of money. But yeah, I'm not sure 100%, but I do think that we've all touched on it today. It's what is the use case? What is the workload? What are we asking it to do? And I think we will find, people ask their cars to drive them home today, which is not something that happened years ago. And some of us are comfortable with that. Some of us are not. And I can honestly tell you, I really want to go to Arizona and drive around in one of those Wagyu cars and see how it goes. My wife has told me to have a really nice time, and she hopes I live through the experience. Everybody's got a different set. I think what we're seeing with, I just put something in the chat, like, where's this line of ethics about telling your boss that ChatGPT did the deliverable? Like, if the deliverable is something simple, like, write a social post that says X, Y, and Z, and ChatGPT does a nice job of it. Were you a smart employee? Is that a good thing? Or if a client asks you to do it, where's that ethics line about, hey, just so you know, I gave you what you paid me to give you, but I actually didn't do it. I allowed an AI to make the decision or drive the car or do the project. It's really opening up some interesting landscape. But I do agree with you, Eric. I think AI will make decisions for us, and we'll all become accustomed to it. We already are. AI drives airplane ticket prices. And you don't see any of us complaining about it. Or if we are, we're learning to work around it by logging in through a different network, so they think I'm coming from a less affluent part of the country to get my ticket to Hawaii. So I think it's super exciting right now. I think there's a lot of terrain to be covered.
Yeah, and there are a lot. Go ahead.
Jurisprudence topic idea was really interesting, because I think in baseball, where there's automated umpiring, starting to call balls and strikes, that technology has actually been around 20 years or so, but people didn't want to replace umpires with lasers and cameras calling balls and strikes. Now they're starting to trust the technology. And now we're starting to see something very similar on that could happen with, say, civil cases going forward.
Yeah, no, that's right. And we saw that, of course, in the World Cup with the offsides calls. And, I watched that, and I have to say, it really was pretty impressive that they were able to get a very clear line of demarcation. Nope, here is when the pass, because for those who don't know, when the pass is launched, you have to be behind one defender, or there's one defender behind you, otherwise you're off sides. And they do that so they don't have guys just waiting back by the goal to knock it in, and you'd have these crazy games. But what a fantastic show today, talking to Shawn Rogers, Hyoun Park, and also Arijit Sengupta from Aible. Podcast bonus segment is coming up next. You have been listening to Inside Analysis.